Hey, welcome back. Tonight I want to take you somewhere you've probably never really thought about, inside a lighthouse. Yeah, the ones you drive past on a coastal trip, snap a photo of, and forget about 5 minutes later. But there was a time when people, alone, for months at a time, actually lived in these things. Just the sea, the dark, and one light that could never, ever go out. So, let's talk about them tonight. Get comfortable, or honestly, just lie down if you already are. There's nowhere to be. Quick thing though, if you've been here before, and I know some of you have, because I see the comments at like 2 a.m. saying still awake, do that again tonight if you want. Whenever you start drifting off, just drop a comment with where you made it to. I actually read those. Genuinely makes my day. There is a moment, somewhere between midnight and the first gray suggestion of morning, when the coastline becomes the loneliest place on earth. Not lonely in the way a quiet room is lonely, or a long drive through empty countryside. Lonely in the way that only open water can produce. A specific, physical kind of solitude that presses against you from all directions at once. The wind has a sound out there that it does not have anywhere else. The sea moves in ways that do not feel indifferent, so much as simply unaware that you exist. And yet, for most of human history, someone was awake in that darkness. Someone was climbing a spiral staircase in the middle of the night, carrying oil, checking a flame, polishing glass that was already clean. Someone was writing in a logbook by the light of a lantern, recording wind speed and wave height, and the names of ships that passed close enough to be counted, while the rest of the world slept without any awareness that this was happening at all. You have probably seen a lighthouse. You may have visited one as a child, or driven past one on a coastal road and felt that particular kind of pleasure that comes from spotting something iconic against a gray sky. You may have a photograph of one somewhere, a postcard, a memory of standing at the base of something tall and striped and wondering, briefly, what it must have been like to live up there. Most of us stop at that wondering. We take the photograph and drive on. This is an attempt to go a little further than that, to climb the stairs, open the door at the top, and stay there long enough to understand what the lighthouse actually was, not as an object, not as a symbol, but as a place where human beings spent their lives. Entire lives. Decades of mornings and nights inside a stone tower at the edge of the world, keeping a flame burning so that other people they would never meet could find their way home. That, by itself, would be remarkable enough. But the story of the lighthouse is not just about the light. It is about the people who lived inside it, beside it, and sometimes in spite of it. It is about the women who kept the lamp burning while their husbands were sick or dead or simply absent. It is about the children who grew up with no neighbors, no schoolmates, no town within walking distance, and who somehow managed to become extraordinarily capable human beings. It is about the keepers who went to pieces in the silence, and the ones who found something in that silence that they had not expected to find. A kind of peace that most people spend their whole lives searching for and never quite locate. It is about storms so violent they cracked stone. About lenses so beautiful they made grown engineers weep. About logbooks written by people who had no idea that what they were recording would one day be considered literature. And it is about what happened when the machines arrived. When electricity replaced oil and automation replaced people and the lighthouse keeper. one of the oldest and strangest professions in human history, simply ceased to exist. There is something worth sitting with in all of that, something that feels, in a quiet way, like it matters. So, the light is on. The stairs are narrow. The wind is doing what it always does out there. Come up. Before we talk about the lighthouse keeper, we need to talk about what the coast looked like before there were any lighthouses at all. Because it is very easy, from where we are now, with GPS and radar and satellite navigation and ships that can identify their precise position to within a few meters, to forget how genuinely, catastrophically dangerous the coastline once was. The sea has always been the fastest way to move things. Faster than roads, faster than rivers, faster than any land route through mountains or forests or difficult terrain. Every civilization that had access to the sea eventually used it, and used it heavily, because the alternative was slower and harder and more expensive. Grain, wine, timber, copper, salt, cloth, people, everything moved by ship if it could. And ships, for most of human history, moved at the mercy of conditions they could not fully predict and could not fully control. The open ocean was dangerous, certainly. But the coast was in many ways more dangerous still, because the coast is where the sea and the land meet. And that meeting is almost never gentle. Rocks that sit just below the surface at high tide and tear a hull open with no warning. Sandbars that shift position over seasons. Currents that behave differently, depending on the time of year, the phase of the moon, the direction of the wind. Headlands that create confused water on their far side that no experienced sailor would call predictable. And at night, the coast was essentially invisible. A ship's captain, approaching a familiar coastline in good daylight, with a calm sea and clear visibility, was a skilled professional performing a task he had performed many times before. That same captain, approaching the same coastline in darkness, in fog, in a storm that had pushed him off his intended course, was in a situation that had no reliable solution. He could not see what was ahead of him. He could hear the surf sometimes, but by the time you can hear the surf, it is often already too late to do very much about it. The Romans understood this. The Greeks understood it before them. The Phoenicians understood it before either of them. And every civilization that understood it tried to do something about it, in whatever way was available to them. The earliest solution was fire. Not a lighthouse in any architectural sense, just a fire, lit at the top of a hill or a headland, by local people who understood that ships needed to know where the land was. Sometimes these fires were maintained by religious communities, monasteries, or temples that sat on coastal high ground and kept a flame burning through the night as an act of piety as much as practicality. Sometimes they were maintained by port authorities, who recognized that a visible coastline was good for commerce. Sometimes they were simply maintained by local fishermen and their families, who had a personal and immediate interest in knowing that the ships coming into their bay at night would arrive safely rather than on the rocks below their houses. These early fire beacons were irregular, unreliable, and entirely dependent on whoever happened to be responsible for maintaining them on any given night. They were not lighthouses in any meaningful institutional sense, but they were the beginning of an idea that would eventually become one of the most sophisticated coastal safety systems in human history. The idea was simple. If you put a light in the right place and keep it burning reliably, ships can find their way. The execution of that idea would take roughly 2,000 years to get anywhere close to right. The Pharos of Alexandria is the lighthouse that everyone mentions first, and it deserves the mention because it was genuinely extraordinary. Built sometime around 280 BCE on a small island in the harbor of Alexandria, Egypt, the Pharos was by most historical accounts one of the tallest structures in the ancient world, possibly reaching somewhere between 100 and 140 meters in height, though historians debate the precise figure. What is not in debate is that it was visible from an enormous distance at sea. Ancient sources suggest up to 50 kilometers on a clear day, and that it functioned as a navigational landmark for the ships entering and leaving one of the busiest ports in the Mediterranean. The light source at the top was almost certainly a large fire, possibly reflected and amplified by polished bronze mirrors, though the exact mechanics have been debated by scholars for centuries. The structure itself was built in 3 stages: a square base, an octagonal middle section, and a cylindrical top, and was decorated and maintained as a monument to the ambitions of the Ptolemaic dynasty. It was, in other words, a lighthouse that was also a statement about the kind of civilization Alexandria considered itself to be. It stood, in various states of repair and damage, for approximately 1,400 years. Damaged by earthquakes, partially repaired, damaged again, eventually reduced to rubble that was incorporated into a later fortification on the same site. By the time it disappeared entirely, it had been standing longer than Christianity had existed. The word Pharos eventually became the word for lighthouse in several European languages: phare in French, Pharaoh in Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese, a linguistic inheritance from a building that no longer exists. The Romans built lighthouses throughout their empire, many of them on the model of the Pharos. Tall, fire-lit, positioned at the entrances to important harbors. Several of these structures survive in some form. The Tower of Hercules, in what is now Galicia, in northwestern Spain, has been in continuous operation since the 2nd century CE, making it the oldest working lighthouse in the world. It was originally built during the reign of Emperor Trajan, restored in the 18th century, and continues to operate today with an automated light visible for more than 32 kilometers at sea. Standing beside it, and knowing that Roman ships once used that same point of land to find their way into the Atlantic, is a particular kind of historical vertigo that photographs do not quite capture. But between the fall of the Roman Empire and the beginning of organized maritime commerce in the medieval period, lighthouse infrastructure largely declined. The fires went out on many Roman towers. The knowledge of how to maintain them systematically faded. The coast became dark again in many places, and the ships that sailed it simply learned to be more careful, or paid the price for failing to be. The medieval period saw the gradual reemergence of coastal lighting, but in fragmented, local, inconsistent ways. Church towers near the coast sometimes displayed lights. Harbor towns maintained simple fire baskets or lanterns on poles at the water's edge. Guilds of sailors and merchants in certain cities established their own private lighthouse arrangements, funding a keeper and a light at a dangerous headland out of practical self-interest rather than civic responsibility. The English coast offers a good example of how complicated and contested this history actually was. By the 13th and 14th centuries, a number of lights existed along the English and Welsh coasts, but they were maintained by an assortment of religious houses, local landowners, and informal arrangements that had no consistent standard, no reliable oversight, and no guarantee of continuity. When a monastery was dissolved during the Reformation in the 16th century, whatever coastal light it had been maintaining often went out too. Not because anyone decided to extinguish it, but because the institution responsible for it no longer existed. This is where Trinity House enters the story. Established by royal charter in 1514 under Henry VIII, Trinity House was a guild of master mariners initially based in Deptford, on the Thames. Over the following century, it gradually acquired authority over the lighthouses of England and Wales, though the process was long, contested, and frequently tangled in the competing financial interests of private lighthouse owners who had been granted patents to collect tolls from passing ships in exchange for maintaining a light. Private lighthouses, it is worth understanding, were not necessarily a bad idea in theory. If you allowed a private individual to build a lighthouse and collect a small fee from the ships that benefited from it, you created a financial incentive for lighthouse construction and maintenance that did not depend on public funds. The problem was that private lighthouse operators sometimes maintained their lights poorly, collected tolls aggressively, and showed limited enthusiasm for investing in improvements that would have made the lights more effective but would not have increased their income. The tension between public safety and private profit on the coastline is not a recent invention. Trinity House eventually acquired control of most private lighthouses in England and Wales in 1836, under an Act of Parliament that allowed it to purchase the remaining private patents. This consolidation made it possible, for the first time, to think about the English lighthouse system as a system, coherent, standardized, and capable of being improved according to engineering principles rather than the financial preferences of individual owners. Similar processes happened in other countries on different timescales. France, Scotland, Ireland, the United States, each developed its own lighthouse authority, its own approach to construction and staffing, its own particular culture of the keeper. The details differ, but the underlying story is the same everywhere. A gradual recognition that the coastline was too important to leave to chance or private whim, and that the only way to maintain a reliable network of lights was to treat it as a public responsibility. Now, the keeper. It is easy to romanticize the lighthouse keeper, and most people do, because the image is so compelling. A solitary figure in a tall stone tower surrounded by sea, tending a light that never goes out. There is something in that image that speaks to something most of us feel but rarely examine. A longing for simplicity, for a single clear purpose, for a life stripped of distraction and noise. The reality was somewhat more complicated than the image, and somewhat less romantic in its daily texture, but also in some ways more remarkable, because the lighthouse keeper's life was genuinely demanding in ways that the romantic image tends to smooth over. First, how did someone become a lighthouse keeper? The process varied by country, by era, and by the particular lighthouse authority involved, but certain patterns were consistent across most systems. In England and Wales, Trinity House typically required applicants to be men of good character, physically fit, and capable of maintaining the equipment to the required standard. Former sailors were frequently preferred, both because they understood the maritime purpose of the lighthouse, and because they had already demonstrated an ability to tolerate confined conditions in an exposed environment. Many keepers were indeed former Royal Navy or Merchant Navy men who had reached an age where sea service was no longer practical and were looking for shore-based work that still kept them close to the water. In the United States, the Lighthouse Service, which operated independently until it was merged into the Coast Guard in 1939, had its own hiring practices, which evolved over time. In the early years of the Republic, lighthouse keeperships were patronage appointments, handed out by politicians to supporters regardless of qualification. A keeper might be a political ally of the local congressman with no particular maritime experience and no particular aptitude for the technical demands of the job. This system produced some genuinely disastrous outcomes. Lights poorly maintained, equipment damaged, records incomplete, and in a few cases, lights that simply were not lit on certain nights because the keeper had not bothered. The reform of the American lighthouse system in the mid-19th century, largely driven by a damning report by officers of the Army Corps of Engineers in 1851, transformed the lighthouse service into something resembling the professional organization it should always have been. Standards for keepers were established and enforced. Equipment was standardized. Inspection regimes were introduced. The transition from patronage to professionalism was not instantaneous or painless, but by the latter half of the 19th century, the American keeper was expected to be a competent, diligent, and accountable professional rather than a political favor returned. In France, the system of lighthouse administration, managed by the Ponts et Chaussées, the engineering corps responsible for bridges and roads, was considerably more technically rigorous from an earlier date, partly because French lighthouse engineering was, for much of the 19th century, simply more advanced than that of any other country. The reason for this gets us to a piece of machinery that deserves far more admiration than it typically receives. But before we get to the machinery, it is worth spending a moment on what the keeper was actually hired to do in the simplest possible terms. The job was this: keep the light burning every night, without exception, from sunset to sunrise, in all weathers, regardless of what was happening in your personal life or your health or the state of your relationships with the other keeper or keepers who shared the station with you. That was the essential obligation. Everything else, the log keeping, the equipment maintenance, the fog signal, the housekeeping, the correspondence with the lighthouse authority, the rescue of shipwreck survivors, was built on top of that central requirement. Keep the light burning. It sounds simple. In the era before electricity, it was not simple at all. The light sources used in lighthouses before the widespread adoption of electricity in the late 19th and early 20th century were primarily oil lamps of various types. In the earliest period, these were simple vessel lamps burning animal fat or fish oil, smelly, smoky, relatively dim, and requiring constant attention to maintain an adequate flame. The introduction of argand lamps in the late 18th century, which used a cylindrical wick and a glass chimney to create a brighter, more controlled flame, was a significant improvement. Spermaceti oil, from sperm whales, burned more cleanly and brightly than most alternatives and was the preferred fuel in many lighthouse systems through much of the 19th century, which made lighthouse keeping economically linked to the whaling industry in ways that are not immediately obvious. Colza oil, derived from rapeseed, was used extensively in European lighthouses, particularly in France, as a somewhat more accessible alternative to whale oil. Mineral oil, and later kerosene, became dominant fuels in the later 19th century as petroleum production increased, and they burned more consistently and were easier to handle than the animal and vegetable oils that preceded them. The keeper's relationship with this fuel was intimate and daily. The oil reservoirs had to be filled. The wicks had to be trimmed to precisely the right length. Too short, and the flame was dim. Too long, and it smoked and charred the lens. The chimneys had to be cleaned. The reservoirs had to be positioned correctly relative to the burner. The whole assembly had to be checked at regular intervals through the night, because an oil lamp left completely unattended for more than a couple of hours was an oil lamp that might have gone out, or might be producing a flame that was too dim to serve its purpose, or might be on the verge of causing a fire inside the lantern room. Keepers at major lighthouses typically worked in rotation with at least one other keeper, a principal keeper, and one or more assistant keepers, so that the watch could be divided through the night. One keeper would tend the light from dusk until perhaps midnight, then wake their colleague to take the second watch through until dawn. At smaller lights and at isolated stations, particularly in the American system where single-family light stations were common, a single keeper might be responsible for everything, with their spouse or older children serving as unpaid assistants whose labors made the whole operation viable. That unpaid labor is a part of the lighthouse story that the official records tend to understate, but it is enormously significant. Many lighthouses in the United States, in particular, were kept operational not by the paid keeper alone, but by the entire family unit working together. The keeper's wife cooking, leaning, maintaining the keeper's log in her husband's absence, tending the light when illness or injury made it impossible for him to climb the stairs, watching for ships in distress, signaling to the mainland. These women were not, in most cases, officially recognized as keepers. They were not paid for their work. They were simply understood to be part of the system, because the system could not have worked without them. We will come back to them in some detail later, because their story is one of the genuinely important hidden histories of the lighthouse. The first morning inside the lighthouse. Imagine you are a new assistant keeper, arriving at your first posting in, say, the 1870s. The Lighthouse Authority has sent you to a rock station on the coast, not one of the truly exposed offshore rocks, but a proper coastal station, attached to a headland, with a keeper's cottage adjacent to the tower. Your predecessor has left a thorough set of notes. The principal keeper, who has been here for 11 years, meets you at the door and shakes your hand with the kind of firmness that communicates, without words, that he takes this job seriously and expects you to do the same. The tower is taller than you expected. From a distance, lighthouses always look manageable. Standing at the base and looking up, there is a moment of recalibration. The stairs are iron, spiral, narrow, worn smooth in the center from years of ascending boots. The smell is oil and salt and something else, a particular mineral coldness that comes from being inside very thick stone walls. The lantern room at the top is all glass and brass and engineering precision, and in the center of it is the lens. The lens will stop you. It is not like seeing a machine. It is not like seeing furniture or equipment or anything you have a ready category for. It is a thing of such precise and deliberate beauty that several engineers and keepers who encountered great lighthouse lenses for the first time recorded their immediate reaction as something close to awe. Concentric rings of glass, each one ground to a fractional tolerance and angled with absolute precision, surrounding a central bullseye through which the light passes and is gathered and shaped into a single focused beam that carries for miles out over the dark water. The principal keeper watches you look at it, and he can tell by your expression that you understand something important, which is that this machine is worth caring for, that it deserves the hours of polishing and checking and maintenance that it will require from you, that there is a reason the lens cloths are clean and the brass fittings are spotless, and the clockwork mechanism that rotates the whole assembly is wound and tested and recorded in the log every day. He will show you how to clean the lens panels very gently with a specific cloth in a specific direction, never touching the glass directly with bare skin because the oils from your fingers will cloud it. He will show you how to trim the wick to the correct length, how to fill the oil font, how to check the clockwork mechanism that keeps the lens rotating at the precise speed required to produce the station's characteristic pattern of flashes. Because every lighthouse has its own rhythm, its own signature of light, so that a ship's navigator can identify which lighthouse they are looking at without any other information. This characteristic flash pattern is called the light's character, and it is, in miniature, the lighthouse's identity. One flash every 10 seconds. 2 flashes every 15 seconds. A long flash followed by 2 short flashes. Each lighthouse has its own, published in the annual light lists that navigators consult, and the keeper is responsible for ensuring that the character of their light never deviates from its published specification, because a navigator who sees a light flashing at the wrong interval will draw entirely the wrong conclusions about where they are. The weight of this responsibility settles on the new keeper slowly over the first few days. It is not dramatic. Nobody announces it. It is simply there, in the way the principal keeper speaks about the log, in the way he shows you how to test the fog signal, in the way he explains the inspection schedule, in the way he mentions, almost in passing, that the Lighthouse Authority's inspector will arrive unannounced at some point in the next few months, and will check everything and will have opinions about anything that is not exactly right. But underneath the procedural weight, there is something else that the new keeper begins to notice after the first few nights. Something that is harder to name. Standing at the top of the tower at 2 in the morning, watching the beam sweep out over the black water, you become aware of a particular quality of responsibility that is different from any other kind. You are not responsible for your own safety, or the safety of people you know, or a specific task with a beginning and an end. You are responsible for something invisible and ongoing, the faith of every ship's navigator within 20 miles of your station, that the light they are using to determine their position is exactly where the chart says it should be, and exactly as bright and regular as the light list says it should be, and that it will continue to be so for the rest of this night and every night that follows. You are, in a very literal sense, part of the infrastructure of the world. That is not a comfortable feeling. It is also, for certain kinds of people, not an entirely unpleasant one. Let us talk about the numbers for a moment, not because numbers are the most interesting part of this story, but because without some sense of scale, it is easy to underestimate what the lighthouse system actually represented. At the peak of the staffed lighthouse era, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there were approximately 1,500 staffed lighthouses along the coastline of Great Britain and Ireland, operated by Trinity House, the Northern Lighthouse Board, and the Commissioners of Irish Lights. In the United States, the lighthouse service at its peak operated more than 400 light stations, employing somewhere around 5,600 lighthouse keepers. France maintained hundreds of staffed lights along its Atlantic and Mediterranean coasts. Norway, with its extraordinarily complicated coastline, had one of the densest lighthouse systems in the world relative to its population. Canada, Australia, and New Zealand each maintained extensive lighthouse services appropriate to their vast coastlines. In total, across all maritime nations, the number of people employed as lighthouse keepers or lighthouse keepers' assistants in the late 19th century was almost certainly in the tens of thousands. Not all of them were stationed at dramatic rock towers or exposed headlands. Many were at modest harbor lights or bay markers that required very little more than showing up every evening and making sure the lamp was lit. But the aggregate human investment in maintaining the world's coastal lighting system was enormous, and it is almost entirely invisible to us now, because it disappeared so gradually and so completely that there is barely a trace of it left in living memory. The last staffed lighthouse in England was automated in 1998. The last in Scotland a year later. In the United States, Boston Light, the oldest lighthouse site in the country, with a history stretching back to 1716, was the last to retain a keeper, and it retains one today, though in a largely ceremonial role as a living museum to the tradition. For most practical purposes, the era of the lighthouse keeper ended sometime in the last quarter of the 20th century, not with a ceremony or a formal conclusion, but with a series of practical decisions made by lighthouse authorities around the world, each one concluding that the equipment was now reliable enough to operate without human supervision, that the cost of maintaining families or rotating crews at remote stations was no longer justified, and that the light itself, the one constant through all of this, could continue perfectly well without anyone climbing the stairs to check on it. Whether that conclusion was entirely right is a more complicated question than it appears, and we will come back to it. For now, the stairs, the oil, the logbook, the clockwork mechanism ticking over in the lantern room above your head. There is a particular quality to nights in a lighthouse that nobody talks about very much, perhaps because very few people have experienced them, and those who have tend to reach for language that sounds like poetry, even when they are trying to be matter-of-fact. The silence is not actually silence. There is always wind, always water, always the mechanical rhythm of the rotating lens and the ticking of the clockwork. But beneath those sounds, there is a quality of stillness that is distinct from anything most people encounter in ordinary life. A stillness that comes from being completely separated from the noise of human settlement, from traffic and voices and the ambient hum of electrical systems and the general low roar of civilization that we are all so accustomed to that we have stopped noticing it. Keepers who spent long periods at lighthouse stations frequently reported this as one of the most striking features of the experience, the sheer acoustic clarity of a world without background noise. The sound of a ship's engine, audible miles before the ship itself, was visible. The cry of a seabird at 3 a.m, startlingly clear. The precise sound of the sea on the rocks below, whose changing character told an experienced keeper as much about the state of the weather as any barometer. The logbook recorded all of this, in its formal and abbreviated way. Wind direction, wind force, visibility, sea state, weather, light burning, machinery functioning normally, passing vessels when they could be identified, anything unusual. The log had spaces for all of these things, and the keeper was required to fill them in at regular intervals through the night and day. Every day, without exception. What the official logbook spaces could not quite contain was the quality of the experience itself. The texture of a night spent in a lighthouse lantern room, with the beam rotating overhead, and the sea doing whatever the sea was doing outside the glass, and the knowledge that somewhere out there, a ship was perhaps using your light at this exact moment to determine a course correction that would bring it safely past the headland and into calmer water. Some keepers wrote about this in the margins of their logs, or in personal diaries, or in letters to families and friends ashore. And what they wrote is, in many cases, surprisingly moving. Not because it is dramatic, but because it is so consistently honest about the strangeness and the weight and the occasional unexpected beauty of a life spent in service to a light. Those letters and diaries are part of what this story is really about. Not just the engineering and the history and the organizational structures. The people. The particular human beings who chose this particular life, or had it chosen for them, and what they found when they got there. We have only scratched the surface of their world. The stairs still go up. The light is still turning. And outside, somewhere in the dark, a ship is using it right now, without thinking very much about the tower it is coming from, or the long, strange human history contained within its walls. The lens deserves its own chapter in this story, because it changed everything. Before we get to the keeper's daily life in full detail, before we talk about what they ate and how they slept, and what they did when the storms came, we need to stop and look properly at the thing that sat at the center of their world, the thing they spent more time with than any other object in their lives, the thing that turned a simple flame into something visible from 20 miles away. The Fresnel lens. Augustin Jean Fresnel was a French physicist who, in the early 1820s, was working on problems of light and optics that had occupied some of the best scientific minds in Europe for over a century. The fundamental challenge was straightforward to describe and extremely difficult to solve. A naked flame, even a bright one, radiates light in all directions more or less equally. Most of that light goes upward or downward or inland, directions where it does nobody at sea any good at all. The light that actually reaches the horizon, the light that a ship can use, is a tiny fraction of the total output. To make a lighthouse effective at any serious distance, you needed to find a way to capture as much of that wasted light as possible and redirect it toward the horizon. Mirrors were the first approach, and they worked tolerably well. Parabolic reflectors placed behind the flame could bounce some of the backward-directed light forward, increasing the effective brightness of the light as seen from the sea. The problem was that mirrors were heavy, expensive, difficult to manufacture to the precision required, and tended to tarnish over time, reducing their reflective efficiency. A lighthouse using a reflector system needed multiple large reflectors, carefully angled, and even then the amount of light captured and redirected was a fraction of what was theoretically possible. Fresnel's insight was to use refraction instead of reflection. Rather than bouncing the light off a mirror, he would bend it through glass. And rather than using a single massive lens, which would have been impossibly heavy and impossibly expensive, and probably impossible to manufacture at the size required, he designed a lens made of concentric rings of glass prisms, each one angled to capture light from a specific part of the flame and redirect it toward the horizon. The central section of the lens was a large bullseye, a thick disc of glass ground to a convex curvature that collected the light directly in front of the flame and focused it into a concentrated beam. Above and below this central section, concentric rings of triangular glass prisms captured the light that would otherwise have gone upward and downward and bent it, through total internal refraction, into the same horizontal beam. The result was a lens that captured nearly all of the light produced by the flame and concentrated it into a thin, extraordinarily powerful sheet of light aimed directly at the horizon. The first Fresnel lens was installed in the Cordouan Lighthouse at the mouth of the Gironde estuary in France in 1823. The effect was, by all contemporary accounts, astonishing. The light from Cordouan was visible at a distance that made observers question whether they were looking at a lighthouse or a star. A single oil flame, modest in itself, was being transformed by the lens into something that could be seen from over 30 kilometers away on a clear night. Engineers from other countries came to see it. They stood in front of it and tried to understand what they were looking at. Robert Stevenson, the great Scottish lighthouse engineer, visited Cordouan and returned to Edinburgh convinced that the Fresnel system was the future of lighthouse illumination. He was right. Within 2 decades, Fresnel lenses were being manufactured for lighthouses around the world, and the old reflector systems were being phased out everywhere. The lenses were classified by order, from first order, the largest, used in major coastal lighthouses where maximum range was essential, down to sixth order, used in small harbor lights and minor aids to navigation. A first-order Fresnel lens stood nearly 4 meters tall and weighed several tons. The glass panels were handmade by specialized craftsmen at a small number of factories, primarily in France, and each panel had to be ground and polished to an optical precision that left almost no margin for error. A single flaw in a single panel would distort the beam and reduce the range of the light. Here is a detail that sometimes surprises people. These lenses floated, not on water, on mercury. The weight of a first-order Fresnel lens, fully assembled with its brass framework and its rotating mechanism, was far too great to be supported on conventional bearings without generating friction that would make rotation impractical. The solution, developed in the mid-19th century, was to mount the lens on a bath of liquid mercury, the dense silvery metal that is liquid at room temperature. Mercury is heavy enough to support the weight of the lens assembly, while providing an almost perfectly frictionless surface on which the entire apparatus could rotate. A clockwork mechanism, driven by a weighted cable descending through the center of the tower, provided the slow, steady rotation that produced the lighthouse's characteristic flash pattern. This meant that lighthouse keepers worked every day of their professional lives in very close proximity to large quantities of liquid mercury. The health implications of chronic mercury exposure were not well understood during most of the period when mercury baths were in use, and the evidence that some keepers suffered neurological effects from prolonged exposure is, with hindsight, unsurprising, but was not systematically investigated at the time. The phrase "mad as a hatter" refers to a similar occupational mercury exposure in the hat-making trade, but the lighthouse keeper's version of this story is less well known. It is one of those details that quietly reframes the entire romantic image of the lighthouse, the beautiful, glowing lens rotating serenely in its tower was also, in a very literal sense, a hazardous workplace. Keepers were not told this. Most of them probably would not have changed their behavior if they had been told, because there was no alternative. The mercury bath was the technology that made the rotating lens possible, and the rotating lens was the technology that made the lighthouse visible from the distance required. You could not have one without the other. And the keeper was the human being positioned at the intersection of these competing necessities. The Fresnel lens is arguably the most important optical instrument in maritime history. It saved an incalculable number of lives over the century and a half of its dominance. It was also, considered purely as an object, one of the most beautiful pieces of engineering ever produced, a fact that keepers themselves were well aware of and frequently commented on. There is something about a first-order Fresnel lens, lit from within, rotating slowly in the dark, that transcends its function. It looks like something from a cathedral. Several keepers, in their personal writings, compared it to exactly that. This was the machine that the keeper served. This was the thing at the top of the stairs. And everything else in the keeper's daily life, every routine, every task, every hour of the night watch, radiated outward from it. A keeper's day did not begin when the sun rose. In many ways, it began the evening before, because the lighthouse operated on a cycle defined by sunset and sunrise, and the keeper's schedule was organized around those two events with an exactness that most people would find difficult to sustain for a week, let alone a career. The official record of the light being exhibited, the lamp lit, the lens rotating, the light visible to ships, was made every evening at or just before sunset. This record appeared in the logbook, in the keeper's handwriting, in the format prescribed by the lighthouse authority without fail. The corresponding entry, recording the light being extinguished at sunrise, closed the cycle. Between those two entries lay everything that mattered. Before sunset, the keeper's primary task was preparation. The oil reservoir had to be filled to the correct level. The wick had to be inspected and trimmed. The chimney had to be cleaned. The lens panels had to be polished. And the keeper's cloths had to be clean and dry and free of any grit that might scratch the glass. The clockwork mechanism had to be wound. The weights, which hung on a cable that ran down through the center of the tower and drove the rotation of the lens, had to be hauled up to the top of their travel, a task that required considerable physical effort and was performed by hand, usually by winding a crank. At sunset, the lamp was lit, the lens began to rotate, the light was exhibited. And then the watch began, at a station staffed by a principal keeper and one or two assistants. The night was divided into watches. The exact schedule varied by authority and by station, but a typical arrangement might have the principal keeper taking the first watch from sunset until midnight, the first assistant taking the middle watch from midnight until 4 in the morning, and the second assistant taking the morning watch from 4 until sunrise. At stations with only 2 keepers, the night was split in half. At single keeper stations, the keeper was responsible for the entire night, which meant that extended sleep was a luxury available only during the day, and only if nothing else demanded attention. During the watch, the keeper was required to be awake, alert, and present in or near the lantern room. The light had to be checked at regular intervals. The oil level had to be monitored. The wick had to be trimmed as it burned down. The clockwork had to be rewound when the weights reached the bottom of their travel. Any change in weather conditions had to be recorded. If fog rolled in, the fog signal had to be started, a separate and physically demanding piece of equipment that we will come to shortly. In the gaps between these tasks, the keeper waited. This is the part of the lighthouse keeper's life that is hardest to explain to someone who has not experienced anything similar. The gaps between tasks were not empty. They were filled with a particular kind of alertness, a sustained, low-level attentiveness to the light, the weather, the sea, and the sounds of the station, maintained for hours at a time in near total isolation from any other human being. It was not idleness. A keeper who fell asleep on watch was subject to immediate disciplinary action, and in extreme cases, dismissal. The lighthouse authorities understood that a dark light or a malfunctioning signal could directly cause the loss of a ship and everyone aboard it, and they treated the keeper's alertness as a matter of life and death, which it was. Some keepers read during their watches, some knitted, some carved, some wrote. Some simply sat in the lantern room and watched the beam sweep across the water, noting the shape of the sea and the character of the sky with an attention that would have been exceptional in any other context, but was, in the lighthouse, simply part of the job. Dawn brought relief, but not rest. After the light was extinguished at sunrise, the real work of the day began. The lens had to be cleaned, every panel, every prism, every brass fitting. The soot from the night's burning had to be removed, the glass polished to optical clarity, the metalwork inspected for corrosion. This was painstaking, physically delicate work that could take several hours, and it was performed every single day, regardless of how the night had gone. A dirty lens was a dim lens, and a dim lens was a lens that did not do its job. The keeper understood this not as an abstraction, but as a direct relationship between the time spent cleaning and the distance at which a ship could see the light. After the lens, the rest of the station required attention. The tower interior had to be cleaned, stairs swept, walls wiped, windows washed. The keeper's quarters had to be maintained to a standard that would satisfy an inspection. Brass had to be polished. Paintwork had to be touched up. The fog signal machinery had to be tested and maintained. Stores had to be inventoried. Correspondence had to be written. The logbook had to be updated with the morning's observations. At offshore rock stations, those lighthouses built on exposed rocks that were accessible only by boat, and sometimes not even that. All of this was complicated by the logistics of supply. Everything the keepers needed, food, fuel, water, replacement parts, personal mail, clean clothing, had to be delivered by a supply vessel that visited on a schedule determined by the weather, not by the keeper's convenience. If a storm prevented the supply vessel from reaching the rock, the keepers continued with whatever they had until the weather relented. There are documented cases of keepers at rock stations going weeks beyond their scheduled supply date, rationing food and fuel, isolated from any contact with the shore, maintaining the light on diminishing resources with no certainty about when relief would arrive. This was the life. This was what the keeper did, not for a week or a season, but for years, for decades, for a career that might last 30 or 40 years at the same station, or at a series of stations, each one remote, each one demanding, each one organized around the same fundamental rhythm of preparation, exhibition, watch, maintenance, and rest. It shaped people in ways that are hard to describe without speaking to the keepers themselves, most of whom are no longer alive to be spoken to. But their logbooks survive. Their letters survive. Their families remember. And what comes through, again and again, in those sources is not misery and not contentment exactly, but something stranger, a deep and particular kind of engagement with a task that most people would find unbearable. The fog signal was the lighthouse keeper's least favorite responsibility by a very wide margin, and this was true across virtually every lighthouse system in the world where fog signals were required. To understand why, you need to understand what fog does to a lighthouse. A lighthouse is a visual aid to navigation. It works because light travels in straight lines through clear air and can be seen from a long distance. Fog neutralizes this completely. A first-order Fresnel lens producing a beam visible for 20 miles in clear conditions might be invisible at 200 yards in thick fog. The light was still there, still burning, still rotating, but it might as well not have existed. And fog did not announce its arrival on a convenient schedule. It came when it came, sometimes within minutes, sometimes persisting for days. It came most often in exactly the conditions when shipping was most active and most vulnerable. Mild weather with light winds, when vessels were moving through coastal waters with confidence, unaware that visibility was about to collapse around them. The fog signal was the backup system. If ships could not see the light, they could at least hear the fog signal, a powerful, sustained sound broadcast from the lighthouse at regular intervals with a characteristic pattern that identified the station in the same way the light's flash pattern did. The technology of fog signals evolved over the decades. Early fog signals included cannons, bells, and gongs, crude, limited in range, and exhausting to operate manually. The introduction of compressed air foghorns in the mid-19th century was a major improvement, but the equipment required to produce compressed air was heavy, complicated, and demanding of constant attention when in operation. Steam-powered fog signals, used at some stations, required the keeper to fire up a boiler and maintain steam pressure for as long as the fog persisted, which might be hours or might be days. The sound produced by a major fog signal was extraordinary. The deep, resonant blast of a diaphone foghorn, the type widely adopted in the early 20th century, could carry for miles across calm water and was one of the most distinctive sounds in the maritime world. But the same qualities that made the sound effective at a distance made it deeply unpleasant to live with at close range. Keepers and their families, stationed at lighthouses with powerful fog signals, lived with a sound that shook the windows, rattled crockery on shelves, and made conversation impossible during the signal's operation. And the signal operated for as long as the fog lasted. There was no off switch that weather could activate. The keeper determined when fog was present, started the signal, and continued operating it until the fog cleared, checking the visibility at regular intervals and recording every start and stop time in the log. During extended fog episodes, the fog signal might run continuously for 12, 24, 48 hours or more, with the keeper or keepers working in shifts to keep it going. Some stations were foggier than others. There were lighthouses on the coast of Newfoundland where fog was present for more than 100 days a year. Keepers at these stations spent an almost unimaginable amount of time operating and maintaining fog signal equipment, and the strain, physical, psychological, auditory, was significant. Hearing loss among lighthouse keepers stationed at fog-prone locations was common and, like mercury exposure, was not well recognized or compensated during most of the active service period. The fog signal was also the component of lighthouse operation most likely to cause conflict between the lighthouse and the local community. People living near a lighthouse with a powerful fog signal had to listen to it too, and not everyone appreciated the sound at 3 in the morning during a fog event that might last for several days. Complaints from neighbors were a recurring feature of lighthouse administration files, and lighthouse authorities dealt with them in various ways, sometimes sympathetically, sometimes not, but always with the understanding that the signal existed for the safety of ships, and that this purpose took precedence over residential comfort. Families at the lighthouse. The history of lighthouse keeping is often presented as a story about solitary men, but this is misleading, because many lighthouses, particularly land-based and harbor stations, were staffed by keepers who lived there with their wives, their children, and sometimes their extended families. The keeper's cottage, adjacent to, or in some cases built into the base of the lighthouse tower, was the family's home. It was also a government building, maintained to government standards, and subject to inspection at any time. The keeper's family lived, quite literally, inside the infrastructure of the state. Their domestic life was not separate from the keeper's professional duties. It was embedded within them, sometimes inseparably. Wives of lighthouse keepers occupied a role that has no modern equivalent, and that the official records of most lighthouse authorities acknowledged only partially and reluctantly. A keeper's wife was not employed by the lighthouse service. She was not paid. She had no formal status, no pension rights, no official recognition. And yet, in practice, she was essential to the operation of the station. She cooked for the keeper. She maintained the cottage. She raised the children. But she also, in many documented cases, performed duties that were indistinguishable from those of a paid keeper. She trimmed the wick. She filled the oil reservoir. She cleaned the lens. She recorded entries in the log. She watched for ships in distress. She operated the fog signal. She did all of this because it needed to be done and because her husband could not do everything alone, particularly at stations where there was no assistant keeper and the full burden of the lighthouse's operation fell on a single household. When the keeper was sick, and keepers got sick, living in damp, exposed, cold conditions for years at a time, his wife kept the light. When the keeper was injured, and injuries were common in a job that involved climbing narrow stairs in the dark, handling heavy machinery, and working in close proximity to fire and pressurized fuel, his wife kept the light. When the keeper died, his wife often kept the light until a replacement could be sent, which at isolated stations could take weeks. There are documented cases of keepers' wives maintaining the light single-handedly during severe storms while caring for young children, with no assistance and no communication with the mainland, because the light had to be kept burning and there was nobody else to do it. These were not rare, heroic exceptions. They were the ordinary functioning of a system that depended on unpaid female labor while officially pretending that it did not. The children of lighthouse keepers grew up in conditions that were radically different from those of their peers ashore. At isolated coastal stations, the nearest school might be several miles away, accessible only on foot or by boat. Some keepers' children were educated at home by their mothers. Some walked extraordinary distances to attend village schools. Some attended school intermittently, when weather and logistics permitted, and spent the rest of their time on the lighthouse grounds, absorbing the rhythms and the knowledge of the station in the way that children absorb anything they are immersed in. Keepers' children frequently describe their childhoods in terms that combined genuine affection with an awareness of isolation that was sharper than most adults realized. They loved the lighthouse. They loved the sea. They loved the particular qualities of a childhood spent in a place that most people only visited as tourists. But they also understood, from a surprisingly early age, that their world was smaller and more constrained than the world their schoolmates lived in. and that the lighthouse demanded things from their family that other families were not asked to give. Some keepers' children became keepers themselves. The profession ran in families in many lighthouse systems, partly because lighthouse authorities preferred to hire people who already understood the life, and partly because children who grew up at a lighthouse had an intuitive grasp of the work that no amount of training could replicate. There are families in Scotland, in Ireland, in New England, and along the Norwegian coast where 3, 4, and even 5 generations served as lighthouse keepers, passing the profession down like a hereditary trade until automation ended the line. Winter at the rock stations, lighthouses built on exposed offshore rocks, sometimes miles from the nearest land, were in a category of their own, and the keepers who served at them knew it. The most famous rock lighthouses in the world are monuments to engineering as much as to seamanship. The Eddystone Lighthouse, built on a small, partially submerged rock in the English Channel 14 miles off Plymouth, was rebuilt 4 times before the current tower was completed in 1882. The first Eddystone Light, a wooden structure built by Henry Winstanley in 1698, was destroyed in the Great Storm of 1703, killing Winstanley and 5 other men inside it. The second, also wooden, was destroyed by fire in 1755. The third, John Smeaton's Tower, built of interlocking granite blocks in a design that became the template for rock lighthouse construction worldwide, stood from 1759 until 1877, when the rock beneath it was found to be undermined by wave action and a new tower was built alongside it. The Bell Rock Lighthouse, built by Robert Stevenson on a submerged reef in the North Sea off the coast of Scotland between 1807 and 1811, was one of the most extraordinary construction projects of its era. The reef was underwater at high tide, which meant that construction could only proceed during the few hours of each tidal cycle when the rock was exposed. Workers were ferried out from the mainland or housed on a temporary floating barracks, moored near the rock, and they worked in conditions of extreme discomfort and genuine danger, laying the foundation stones of a tower on a reef that would try to kill them twice a day when the tide came in. The Bell Rock Light has stood for over 200 years and has never been seriously damaged by the sea. This is a fact that still astonishes engineers, because the forces involved are enormous. Winter storm waves in the North Sea can exceed 20 meters in height and strike a lighthouse tower with forces measured in hundreds of tons per square meter. The tower survives because its granite blocks are interlocked in a pattern that distributes the force of each wave through the entire structure, and because its tapered profile allows the waves to break around it rather than against it. The engineering is brilliant, but engineering alone does not convey what it was like to be inside the tower when a winter storm hit. Keepers at rock stations describe the experience of severe storms in terms that make the modern reader stop and reread the passage. The tower shook. The entire building, this thing made of solid granite, weighing thousands of tons, vibrated with each wave impact. The noise was beyond description. Not a crash, but a sustained, bone-deep concussion that resonated through the stone and the iron and the keeper's own body. Water came through joints in the masonry. Spray reached the lantern room gallery, 100 feet above the sea. The floor moved beneath the keeper's feet, and the light had to be kept burning. That was the rule. That was always the rule. The light was kept burning in fair weather and foul, in calm seas, and in storms that moved the rock itself. The keeper climbed the stairs to the lantern room, checked the flame, trimmed the wick, wound the clockwork, polished the lens, recorded the entry in the log, and descended again, while the sea did its best to make these activities impossible. Rock station keepers served in rotation, typically 4 weeks on the rock, 2 weeks ashore, though the exact schedule varied by authority and by station. Relief was performed by boat, and if the weather did not permit a boat to approach the rock safely, relief did not happen. Keepers were sometimes stranded on the rock for weeks beyond their scheduled relief date, watching the supply vessel appear on the horizon and then turn back because the sea was too rough to make a landing. During these extended periods, food supplies diminished, fresh water became precious, and the psychological weight of isolation intensified. The keepers had each other. Rock stations were never single-handed, but the company of one or two other people in a confined space, with no possibility of leaving, no possibility of privacy, and no certainty about when relief would come, was its own particular form of pressure. Some keepers thrived under this pressure. They found the rock stations exhilarating, even addictive. The sense of being at the absolute edge of human habitation, the raw confrontation with the elements, the intense camaraderie that could develop between keepers who depended on each other completely. These were experiences that some men found intoxicating and could not find anywhere else. Other keepers did not thrive, and their stories are part of this history too. The most famous incident of lighthouse keeper psychology in popular culture is the disappearance of the 3 keepers of the Flannan Isles Lighthouse in December 1900, and it is worth examining carefully, not because it is fully explained, it is not, but because the way people have responded to it reveals a great deal about how we think about lighthouse keepers and the kind of isolation they endured. The Flannan Isles are a small group of uninhabited islands in the Outer Hebrides, off the northwest coast of Scotland. The lighthouse, completed in 1899 and operated by the Northern Lighthouse Board, was staffed by a team of 3 keepers who lived at the station in rotation, with a 4th keeper based ashore as a relief. On December 26, 1900, the relief vessel Hesperus arrived at the Flannan Isles to perform a scheduled crew change and found the lighthouse deserted. The light was not burning. The clock had stopped. The table in the kitchen was set for a meal that had not been eaten. 2 of the 3 sets of outdoor oilskins were missing from their hooks. The 3rd set was still hanging in its place. The 3 keepers, Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, and Donald MacArthur, were never found. No bodies were recovered. No wreckage was identified. The lighthouse itself was undamaged. The last entry in the logbook, made by Marshall, recorded severe storms in the days before the disappearance, but the weather records from the mainland do not fully corroborate the severity described. The Northern Lighthouse Board conducted an investigation and concluded that the 3 men had most likely been swept away by an unexpectedly large wave while attempting to secure equipment or rescue a supply box from the landing platform during a storm. This explanation is plausible. The landing platforms at exposed island lights were genuinely dangerous places during heavy weather, and freak waves are a documented phenomenon in the waters around the Outer Hebrides. But the details that do not quite fit. The set of oilskins still on its hook, suggesting that one keeper had left the lighthouse in a hurry without his weather gear. The set table, the stopped clock, have fueled speculation and mythology for over a century. Theories have ranged from the reasonable to the absurd: murder, madness, a giant wave, a waterspout, a panic triggered by psychological breakdown, even supernatural explanations. What the Flannan Isles incident really tells us is not so much what happened to those 3 men, we will probably never know with certainty, but how powerfully the image of the isolated lighthouse keeper resonates in the human imagination. The idea of 3 men alone on a rock, maintaining a light in the dark, and then simply vanishing, touches something deep in the way we think about solitude, duty, and the sea. It became a poem, a song, an opera, and eventually a feature film, because the mystery at its core is perfectly calibrated to produce the kind of unease that feeds storytelling. For the keepers who continued to serve at rock and island stations after 1900, the Flannan Isles incident was not mythology. It was a workplace hazard. They knew the rocks were dangerous. They knew the sea was not indifferent, but actively hostile. They carried on anyway, because the light had to be kept burning. There were lighter moments. The lighthouse was not all storms and solitude and existential weight. Keepers kept pets, cats, dogs, sometimes birds. They tended gardens at land-based stations, growing vegetables in soil that was often sandy and thin and salt-blasted, coaxing produce out of ground that did not particularly want to cooperate. They fished when the sea permitted. They carved things from driftwood and bone. They played cards. They argued about food. They argued about the logbook. They argued about whose turn it was to wind the clockwork at 3 a.m. And they observed things that nobody else was in a position to observe, because nobody else was in those places, at those hours, for those lengths of time. Lighthouse keepers were some of the earliest and most consistent contributors to ornithological records in many countries, because migratory birds were drawn to the lighthouse beam at night, sometimes in enormous numbers, and the keeper was the only human witness. Birds appeared out of the darkness, circled the lantern room in confusion, struck the glass, and sometimes fell dead or stunned on the gallery outside. Keepers recorded the species, the numbers, the dates, and the weather conditions, and these records, accumulated over decades, became valuable data sets for scientists studying bird migration patterns. Some keepers went further. They banded birds. They kept detailed journals of arrival and departure dates, species by species, season by season. They corresponded with naturalists on the mainland. They became, without formal training and without institutional support, field researchers in a discipline that was only beginning to organize itself professionally. The keeper's position, remote, elevated, maintained through all seasons and all hours, was uniquely suited to this kind of observation, and the scientific community eventually recognized this, though recognition came slowly and was often not accompanied by compensation. The natural world around the lighthouse was, for the keeper, an intimate daily presence in a way that is difficult for most people to imagine. Seals hauled out on the rocks below the tower. Porpoises passed within sight. Whales, at some stations, were regular visitors. The sea changed color with the seasons. The stars were visible with a clarity that had long since disappeared from any inhabited place ashore. The keeper, simply by being where he was, became a witness to the rhythms of the natural world at a level of detail that was available to almost nobody else. This is one of the quiet ironies of the lighthouse life. The keeper was there to serve a machine, the lens, the lamp, the fog signal. But the life that surrounded the machine was anything but mechanical. It was vivid and wild and ceaselessly interesting to anyone with the patience to pay attention. Many keepers had that patience. The life selected for it. We should talk about the inspections. If there is one element of the lighthouse keeper's professional life that combined maximum anxiety with minimum excitement, it was the inspection. Lighthouse authorities ran thorough, regular, unannounced inspections of every station under their jurisdiction. The inspector arrived by boat, usually without advance warning, and walked through every part of the station with a clipboard and a temperament that varied from professional to formidable. Everything was checked. The lens, the lamp, the clockwork, the fog signal, the oil stores, the logbook, the keeper's quarters, the condition of the paintwork, the state of the brass, the cleanliness of the windows, the organization of the supply room, the accuracy of the weather records. A keeper who received a good inspection report felt a satisfaction that was entirely out of proportion to the apparent significance of the event. A keeper who received a poor report felt a corresponding dismay, because the report went into the permanent record and could affect promotion, assignment, and in severe cases, continued employment. The inspection system served a genuine purpose. It maintained standards across a dispersed, isolated network of stations where direct supervision was impossible on a daily basis. It ensured that the lights burned correctly, the fog signals operated reliably, and the keepers maintained the physical plant of the station in a condition that would survive whatever the weather threw at it. Without inspections, standards would have drifted, and drifting standards at a lighthouse could cost lives. But the inspection also created a particular atmosphere at every lighthouse station, a permanent, low-level awareness that someone might arrive at any moment to judge the quality of your work. This awareness was not always comfortable, but it kept the brass polished and the stairs swept and the logbook entries in the correct format. And there is something to be said for a system that achieves that kind of consistency across hundreds of stations, scattered along thousands of miles of coastline. By the mid-19th century, the lighthouse systems of the major maritime nations had reached a level of organizational maturity that was, by the standards of the time, impressive. The lights were reliable. The keepers were professional. The lens technology was advanced and continually improving. The coastline was becoming, for the first time in human history, a navigable environment at night and in poor visibility, and the effect de submerged on maritime commerce and maritime safety was substantial. The number of shipwrecks along well-lit coastlines dropped. Not to zero. Nothing could eliminate shipwrecks entirely, because ships still ran on wind and current and human judgment. And all three were fallible. But the improvement was measurable and significant. Insurance rates for ships traveling along coastlines with good lighthouse coverage fell, which is perhaps the most reliable indicator available that the system was working, because insurance companies are not sentimental about these things. The human cost of maintaining this system was distributed unevenly and absorbed quietly. The keeper's life was hard. The keeper's family's life was harder in some ways, because they had even less choice in the matter. The keeper's wife had not applied for the position. The keeper's children had not consented to growing up on a rock. And yet the system depended on all of them. And the system worked. And the ships came home. And the light kept turning. There is something in that equation that does not quite balance. Something that sits at the heart of the lighthouse story and makes it more complicated and more interesting than a simple tale of engineering progress. The light was beautiful. The lens was brilliant. The engineering was magnificent. But underneath all of it, holding the whole thing together through the long, dark, cold, foggy, relentless nights, were ordinary human beings doing a job that asked more of them than most jobs ask of anyone. They did it because it needed doing. And for many of them, that was enough. The fog is coming in again. The signal needs starting. The clockwork needs winding. And somewhere out there, a ship is looking for the light. We are not done with this story. The women who kept the light deserve far more than a footnote in this history. And the fact that they have been treated as footnotes for so long says something uncomfortable about the way lighthouse history has been recorded and remembered. The official records of most lighthouse authorities were designed to document the activities of the keeper, singular, male, employed. The logbook had his name on it. The correspondence was addressed to him. The inspection reports evaluated his performance. The pension, when one existed, was calculated on his years of service. The entire administrative architecture of the lighthouse system was built around the assumption that the keeper was one man, doing one job, and that everything else that happened at the station was incidental. This assumption was wrong, and the people who administered the system knew it was wrong, because they relied on it being wrong. They relied on the keeper's wife. They relied on her being there, being competent, being willing to do work she was not paid for. And they did not build any of that reliance into the official structure because acknowledging it would have meant paying for it. There were exceptions. In the United States, women were formally appointed as lighthouse keepers in their own right, with pay and official status, in greater numbers than in most other countries. The reasons for this were partly pragmatic. The American lighthouse system had a large number of small, land-based stations that were operated as family units. And when a keeper died or was incapacitated, appointing his widow or daughter as his replacement was the simplest and cheapest way to ensure continuity of service. It was also, in some cases, a recognition that the woman in question had been doing the job all along and was simply the best qualified person available. Hannah Thomas became the keeper of Gurnet Point Lighthouse in Plymouth, Massachusetts, in 1776, after her husband John joined the Continental Army. She maintained the light throughout the Revolutionary War, alone, while raising her children, and is sometimes cited as the first woman to be officially appointed as a lighthouse keeper in the United States, though the records from that period are incomplete enough that the claim is difficult to confirm absolutely. Ida Lewis is perhaps the most famous female lighthouse keeper in American history, and her story illustrates both the capabilities and the contradictions of women's roles in the lighthouse system. Lewis became the de facto keeper of Lime Rock Lighthouse in Newport Harbor, Rhode Island, in the 1850s, when her father, the appointed keeper, suffered a stroke that left him unable to perform his duties. She was a teenager at the time. She rowed the lighthouse boat, maintained the light, and over the course of her life performed at least 18 documented rescues of people in distress in the waters around the lighthouse, pulling drowning men from the harbor in conditions that would have tested anyone. She became famous for these rescues. Newspapers wrote about her. She received medals. President Ulysses Grant visited her at the lighthouse. She was celebrated as a heroine, which she unquestionably was. But she was not officially appointed as keeper of Lime Rock until 1879, more than 20 years after she had begun doing the job, and the salary she received was lower than that paid to male keepers at comparable stations. She served as keeper until her death in 1911, at the age of 69, having spent virtually her entire adult life at the same lighthouse. Her story is extraordinary, but it is also, in a quieter way, ordinary. Extraordinary because of the rescues, the public recognition, the sheer duration of her service. Ordinary because the basic pattern, a woman doing the work of a lighthouse keeper without full recognition or compensation, was repeated at hundreds of stations across the country and around the world. In France, the gardienne de phare was a recognized figure, though her status within the lighthouse administration varied by period and by region. French lighthouse records contain accounts of women who maintained lights at coastal stations while their husbands were at sea or incapacitated, and who did so with a competence that the inspectors noted approvingly, without necessarily recommending that the women be formally appointed. In Scotland, the Northern Lighthouse Board's records contain references to keepers' wives performing duties during their husband's illness or absence, but the board did not, as a general rule, appoint women as keepers. The work was done. The light was maintained. The formal credit went elsewhere. In Norway, where the coastline is extraordinarily long and the lighthouse stations were numerous and often extremely isolated, women played a role in lighthouse keeping that is only now being fully documented by historians. Some Norwegian lighthouse stations were so remote that the keeper's family was the only human presence for miles in every direction, and the division of labor within the family was determined by necessity rather than by any official job description. The keeper's wife might be responsible for the fog signal while the keeper tended the lens. She might stand the night watch while he maintained the exterior of the tower during daylight. The distribution of tasks was practical, continuous, and almost entirely invisible to the administrative hierarchy that ostensibly governed the station. What all of these stories share is a pattern of essential contribution without proportionate recognition. The women who kept the light were not marginal figures in the lighthouse story. They were structural. The system could not have functioned without them. And the fact that most lighthouse histories published before the late 20th century barely mention them is not evidence that they were absent. It is evidence that the people writing the histories were not looking. The lighthouse in wartime is a chapter that most people do not expect, because the lighthouse seems like such a peaceful thing, a light in the dark, a guide for ships, a structure devoted entirely to safety. But a lighthouse is also a navigational asset, and navigational assets are strategic resources, and strategic resources become targets. During the Napoleonic Wars, lighthouses along the coasts of England and France were regarded by both sides as instruments that could serve or betray military interests. A lighthouse that guided friendly shipping also guided enemy shipping. A light that helped your merchants find their harbor also helped the enemy's warships find their targets. The question of whether to keep the lights burning during wartime was never simple, because extinguishing a light to deny its use to the enemy also denied it to your own ships, including your own navy. The British approach during the Napoleonic era was generally to keep the lights burning, on the calculation that British commerce and the Royal Navy depended on them more than the French fleet did. But individual lights were occasionally extinguished during specific threat periods, and the keepers at exposed coastal stations lived with the awareness that their lighthouse could become a target or a landmark for an invasion force. During the First World War, coastal lighthouses in the war zones were dimmed or extinguished as part of the general blackout measures designed to deny navigational aids to enemy submarines and surface vessels. Keepers at some stations were evacuated. Others remained at their posts, maintaining the station in a state of readiness so that the light could be reactivated quickly when military conditions permitted. The Second World War brought far more dramatic consequences. Lighthouses along the coasts of occupied Europe were taken over by German forces and either extinguished, modified, or used as observation posts. The keepers were removed, reassigned, or in some cases, simply told to leave. In Norway, lighthouse stations were occupied by German soldiers who used the elevated positions as lookout points and the buildings as barracks. The keepers who had spent their lives at these stations came back after the war to find them damaged, looted, or fundamentally altered. Along the coast of Britain, lighthouses were extinguished for the duration of the war. The coastline went dark in a way it had not been dark for generations. Ships navigated by radar, by dead reckoning, by the skill of their navigators, and by luck. The number of maritime casualties attributable to the absence of lighthouse coverage during the war is not easily separated from the general carnage of wartime shipping losses, but it was real and significant. Some lighthouses were deliberately destroyed. The retreating German forces in Norway demolished several lighthouse stations to deny their use to the advancing Allies. In the Pacific, Japanese forces destroyed lighthouses across occupied territories. The destruction of a lighthouse was a small act of warfare in the context of a global conflict, but for the communities that depended on those lights, the fishermen, the coastal traders, the ferry operators, it was a loss of safety infrastructure that took years to rebuild. The keepers who returned to their stations after the war sometimes found that the buildings were intact, but the equipment was gone. Lenses had been removed, damaged, or stolen. Fog signal machinery had been stripped for parts, logbooks had disappeared. The accumulated physical record of decades of careful maintenance had been erased by a few years of military occupation. Rebuilding the lighthouse system after the war was, in many countries, a significant engineering and administrative undertaking that received far less public attention than the reconstruction of more visible infrastructure. There is something instructive in this. The lighthouse is one of those systems that becomes visible primarily when it stops working. When it works, nobody thinks about it. When it disappears, the consequences are immediate and often deadly. The wartime experience demonstrated this with painful clarity, and the post-war rebuilding of coastal lighting systems reflected a renewed understanding of just how much the maritime world depended on structures that most people took entirely for granted. False lights. This is one of the darker chapters in the lighthouse story, and it predates organized warfare by centuries. A false light is a light displayed on the coast for the deliberate purpose of misleading ships, causing them to alter course toward danger rather than away from it. The ships would run aground, break up on the rocks, and their cargo would wash ashore, where the people who had set the false light would collect it. This is wrecking. It is, to be direct about it, a form of piracy conducted from the shore, and it was practiced at various times and in various places by coastal communities who found in the sea a source of income that was irregular, amoral, and occasionally lethal to the crews of the ships involved. The extent of deliberate wrecking is a matter of historical debate. Some historians argue that it was widespread along certain coasts: Cornwall, Brittany, the Outer Banks of North Carolina, parts of the Scandinavian coast, during periods when poverty was severe and the legal consequences were either unenforced or non-existent. Others argue that the evidence for systematic, deliberate wrecking is thinner than the folklore suggests, and that many of the stories about false lights were exaggerated or invented by later writers who found the idea more dramatic than the reality. What is not in debate is that wrecking, the salvage of cargo from ships that had run aground, regardless of whether the grounding was deliberately caused, was an established economic activity in many coastal communities, and that the line between legitimate salvage and criminal complicity was not always clearly drawn. When a ship came ashore, the cargo came with it, and coastal people who were accustomed to poverty and intermittent employment were not always inclined to ask detailed questions about how the ship had come to be there. The establishment of organized lighthouse systems was, among other things, a direct response to the problem of wrecking. A reliable, well-maintained lighthouse made false lights less effective because a navigator who could see the real lighthouse and confirm its position and flash pattern would be less likely to be misled by an unauthorized light elsewhere on the coast. The lighthouse was, in this sense, not only a navigational aid, but a form of law enforcement, a permanent, Tate maintained presence on the coastline that made certain kinds of criminal activity more difficult. This is one of those aspects of lighthouse history that tends to get smoothed over in the romantic narrative. The lighthouse was not built purely out of humanitarian concern for the safety of sailors. It was also built to protect commercial interests, to suppress criminal activity, and to extend the authority of the state into coastal areas that had traditionally operated with a high degree of autonomy. The keeper was, among other things, a representative of central authority in a place where central authority had previously been weak or absent. This does not diminish the humanitarian achievement of the lighthouse system. It simply adds complexity. The lighthouse was many things at once: a safety device, a commercial asset, an engineering marvel, a military target, a law enforcement tool, and a home. The keeper lived at the intersection of all these functions, and the job made sense only if you understood all of them. The strangest lighthouses ever built deserve a mention, because the engineering extremes of lighthouse construction reveal something about the determination, sometimes bordering on obsession, that drove the people who built them. We have already talked about the Eddystone and the Bell Rock. But the catalog of improbable lighthouse locations extends far beyond the famous examples. The Minot's Ledge Lighthouse, off the coast of Cohasset, Massachusetts, was built on a submerged rock that was exposed only at low tide and was battered by the full force of the North Atlantic in winter. The first structure, an iron pile lighthouse completed in 1850, was destroyed by a storm in 1851, killing 2 assistant keepers who were inside it when it collapsed. The replacement tower, built of granite blocks between 1855 and 1860, required extraordinary feats of engineering and seamanship to construct, because the rock was underwater for most of every tidal cycle, and the construction crew could work only during brief windows of exposure. The finished tower is still standing. The Tillamook Rock Lighthouse, off the coast of Oregon, was built on a basalt rock in the Pacific Ocean that was so exposed to ocean swells that spray from storm waves regularly reached the lantern room, 133 feet above the sea. During the most severe storms, rocks were thrown by the waves onto the lantern gallery, smashing the glass and extinguishing the light. The keepers lived in conditions so extreme that Tillamook Rock became known in the lighthouse service as Terrible Tilly. It was decommissioned in 1957, and the last keepers to leave reportedly said they would not go back for any amount of money. The Stannard Rock Lighthouse in Lake Superior was built on a submerged reef 24 miles from the nearest land, the most isolated lighthouse in the United States, sometimes called the loneliest place in America. The keepers there were farther from shore than the keepers at most ocean lighthouses, and the weather on Lake Superior in winter is violent enough to rival anything the Atlantic can produce. In Sweden, the Pater Noster Lighthouse was built on a cluster of rocks, so exposed that the keepers had to be winched onto the station by crane from a supply vessel that could not safely approach close enough to use a conventional landing. The name itself, Our Father, was reportedly given by sailors who prayed as they passed the rocks. The Jeddah Lighthouse, in what is now Saudi Arabia, was one of the earliest modern lighthouses in the Middle East, built to guide shipping into the Red Sea port that served as the gateway for pilgrims traveling to Mecca. Lighthouse technology was not confined to northern European waters. Wherever ships moved, wherever coastlines were dangerous, the lighthouse eventually followed, adapted to local conditions and local materials, but serving the same essential function. In Japan, lighthouse construction in the modern sense began during the Meiji era, when the government hired foreign engineers, primarily British and French, to design and build a network of coastal lights that would bring Japanese waters up to international navigational standards. Richard Henry Brunton, a Scottish engineer, designed and supervised the construction of more than 30 lighthouses in Japan between 1868 and 1876, many of which are still standing. Each of these structures represents a decision by someone, an engineer, a government, a lighthouse authority, that a particular stretch of coastline was too dangerous to leave dark, and that the cost and difficulty of building a lighthouse there, no matter how extreme, was justified by the lives and cargo that would be saved. The history of lighthouse construction is, at its most basic, a history of human beings deciding that certain problems were worth solving even when the solutions were absurdly difficult. The logbook. We keep coming back to it because the logbook is, in many ways, the most intimate surviving record of the lighthouse keeper's life. It is also, unexpectedly, a form of literature. This requires some explanation. The logbook was not intended to be literature. It was a bureaucratic instrument, a standardized record of operational data, maintained for administrative purposes and subject to inspection. The entries were formulaic: wind direction, wind force, barometric pressure, visibility, sea state, light exhibited at sunset, light extinguished at sunrise. Fog signal started at a given time. Fog signal stopped at a given time. Vessels observed. Anything unusual. The anything unusual column is where the logbook begins to transcend its official purpose. Keepers recorded events that no other form of documentation would have captured. Ships in distress, rescues attempted, and rescues completed. Storms of particular violence. Unusual wildlife sightings. The arrival of supplies. The failure of equipment. The illness of a fellow keeper. The death of a family member. The condition of the station after a severe weather event. The passage of unusual vessels. The behavior of the sea during exceptional tidal events. Some keepers confine themselves to the minimum required information, recording these events in the clipped, abbreviated language of official correspondence. Others wrote with a freedom and a vividness that suggests they understood, consciously or not, that the logbook was the only audience they had. A keeper at a Scottish lighthouse in the 1890s recorded a storm in language that reads like prose poetry, not because he was trying to write poetry, but because the storm was so beyond ordinary experience that ordinary language could not contain it, and the keeper, alone in the tower with no one to tell, put it in the log because there was nowhere else for it to go. Keepers' logs from stations along the American coast contain entries that document the passage of history through the lens of a single fixed point on the coastline: the movement of warships, the arrival of immigrant ships, the wreck of vessels whose names and cargoes are otherwise lost to the record. The keeper saw it all from the tower, and the log preserves what he saw, sometimes in a single line that contains more information than the keeper probably realized he was recording. Archives around the world hold thousands of these logbooks, many of them unread by anyone since the inspector who last checked them. They are primary sources of extraordinary value for maritime historians, meteorologists, ecologists, and anyone interested in the daily texture of life at the edge of the world. They are also, read as a body, a kind of collective autobiography of a profession that never thought of itself as worth documenting. The keepers wrote because they were required to write. What they wrote, because they were observant and present and honest, turned out to be remarkable. The relationship between the lighthouse keeper and the ships that passed was largely invisible and entirely one-directional. The keeper could see the ships could see the light. But the keeper and the navigator almost never communicated directly, and in most cases, never met. This is a strange feature of the relationship when you think about it. The keeper's entire professional purpose was to serve the navigator. The navigator's safety depended, in certain critical moments, entirely on the keeper's diligence. And yet the two people involved in this transaction, one standing at the top of a tower, the other standing on the bridge of a ship, were separated by miles of dark water and connected only by a beam of light that one produced and the other consumed. Keepers were aware of this relationship in a way that navigators, generally, were not. A navigator used the light as a data point, a position fix, a course confirmation, a warning of proximity to danger. He noted the light, checked it against his chart, adjusted his heading if necessary, and moved on. The keeper, watching the ship's lights pass in the darkness, knew that the vessel's safe passage was, in some small but real way, his doing. He had trimmed the wick. He had polished the lens. He had wound the clockwork. He had kept the light burning through the night. And the ship had used it. And the ship was safe. There was no acknowledgement, no signal, no thank you. The ship passed, and the keeper went back to watching. And the next ship came. And the keeper watched that one too. The emotional economy of this arrangement is peculiar. A life of service to people you never meet, whose gratitude you never receive, whose existence you confirm only by the distant glow of their navigation lights as they pass your station and continue into the darkness beyond. Some keepers found this satisfying. The knowledge that the work mattered was enough. Other keepers found it isolating in a way that compounded the physical isolation of the station. You were alone, doing essential work, for people who did not know your name and would never think to ask it. The lighthouse keeper's relationship with the public was similarly remote. People on shore knew the lighthouse was there. They could see it from the coast road, from the beach, from the windows of their houses. They might hear the fog signal on certain nights, but the keeper himself was largely invisible, a figure associated with the lighthouse in the abstract, but rarely encountered in person, living a life that the public imagined in romantic terms, but understood in almost no practical detail. This gap between the public perception and the private reality of lighthouse keeping is one of the persistent themes of the profession's history. The lighthouse keeper was simultaneously one of the most iconic and one of the most misunderstood figures in the cultural landscape. Everyone knew what a lighthouse keeper was. Almost nobody knew what a lighthouse keeper did. There is a particular kind of beauty in the logbook entries recorded during the transition seasons, spring and autumn, when the character of the light changed with the length of the days. In midsummer, at northern latitudes, the light might be exhibited for only a few hours, because the nights were so short that darkness barely had time to establish itself before dawn began to push it back. The keeper's routine compressed into a brief window of activity: light up, watch, light down, and the long daylight hours were given over to maintenance and the particular restlessness that came from having a job defined by darkness in a season that was almost entirely light. In midwinter, the opposite applied. The light was exhibited for 16, 17, 18 hours at some latitudes, and the keeper's night watches stretched to fill the darkness, and the days were so short that outdoor maintenance had to be compressed into a few hours of gray, low-angled light between sunrise and sunset. The keeper's year was not structured by seasons in the way that a farmer's year was, but it was profoundly shaped by them. The quality of the light changed. The behavior of the sea changed. The bird populations around the lighthouse shifted. The storms came and went according to their own calendar, which was consistent enough to be anticipated, but never quite predictable enough to be taken for granted. And every evening, regardless of the season, the same ritual. The oil, the wick, the match, the flame, the lens beginning to rotate, the beam sweeping out over the water, the log entry, light exhibited. Every morning, the reverse, light extinguished, lens cleaned, oil checked, machinery inspected, log completed. Between those two bookends, the whole world of the lighthouse unfolded. And the keeper was there for all of it, recording what he saw, maintaining what he was given, and sending the light out into the dark for anyone who needed it. The next part of this story is about endings, about what happened when the light no longer needed a keeper, and what the keeper did when the light no longer needed him. But that is ahead of us. For now, the beam is still turning, and someone is still climbing the stairs. The automation of the lighthouse did not happen suddenly. It happened the way most profound changes happen to systems that people depend on. Gradually, practically, and with very little public discussion until it was almost complete. The first step was electricity. When electric light became reliable enough for industrial use in the late 19th century, lighthouse engineers recognized almost immediately that it offered enormous advantages over oil. An electric lamp was brighter. It did not need to be trimmed. It did not produce soot. It did not require the keeper to climb the tower every few hours to adjust the wick or refill the reservoir. It did not carry the same fire risk. And it could be controlled remotely, switched on and off from a distance, which meant that the keeper's physical presence in the lantern room during every hour of darkness was, for the first time, no longer strictly necessary. The first electrically lit lighthouse in the world was the Dungeness Lighthouse on the coast of Kent, England, which was converted to electric arc light in 1862. The technology was experimental at that stage, and the early electric lights had their own problems. Arc lamps required frequent adjustment. The carbon rods that produced the arc burned down and needed replacement. And the generating equipment was heavy, expensive, and prone to failure. But the principle was established. Electric light could replace oil, and when it did, the keeper's role would change fundamentally. The transition from oil to electricity took decades. Many lighthouse authorities were conservative institutions, understandably cautious about replacing a proven technology with a newer one in an application where failure could cost lives. Oil lamps, for all their demands, were well understood. The keeper knew how to maintain them. The supply chain for oil was established. The failure modes were familiar and manageable. Electricity, in the early decades of its availability, was none of these things. But electricity improved, as technologies do, and by the early 20th century, electric lamps were being installed in lighthouses across the developed world. The incandescent bulb replaced the arc lamp. Generators became more reliable. Maine's electricity reached coastal areas that had previously been beyond the grid. And with each improvement, the argument for maintaining a full-time human keeper at every lighthouse became a little harder to sustain. The second step was automation of the rotation mechanism. The clockwork system that rotated the Fresnel lens, driven by weights that the keeper wound by hand, was replaced at many stations by electric motors. This eliminated one of the keeper's most physically demanding and time-critical tasks. The weights no longer needed winding. The motor ran continuously. The lens rotated at the correct speed without human intervention. The third step was the automation of the fog signal. Compressed air and steam-powered fog signals required constant human attention during fog events. Electric fog signals, and later electronic fog detectors that could start and stop the signal automatically based on measured visibility, removed the keeper from this loop entirely. The fog signal became a machine that monitored conditions and responded to them without human input. The fourth step was remote monitoring. As telecommunications improved, it became possible to monitor the status of a lighthouse from a central control room miles or even hundreds of miles away. Sensors detected whether the lamp was burning, whether the lens was rotating, whether the fog signal was operating, whether the power supply was functioning. If something went wrong, an alarm sounded at the control center, and a maintenance crew could be dispatched to investigate. Each of these steps was, individually, a modest technical improvement. Taken together, they transformed the lighthouse from a manned station requiring continuous human presence into an automated system requiring only periodic maintenance visits. The keeper, who had been essential, became optional. And then, in the language of organizational efficiency, redundant. The process of removing keepers from lighthouses was managed differently in different countries, but the emotional trajectory was remarkably consistent everywhere. In Britain, Trinity House began automating its lighthouses in earnest in the 1960s and continued through the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s. The Northern Lighthouse Board followed a similar timeline for the Scottish Lights. The process was methodical. Station by station, the equipment was upgraded, the automation systems were installed and tested, and the keepers were withdrawn. Some keepers were reassigned to other stations that had not yet been automated. Some were offered positions in the Lighthouse Authority's maintenance and logistics operations, trading the life of the tower for the life of a workshop or a supply vessel. Some were offered early retirement. Some simply reached the end of their careers and were not replaced. In the United States, the Coast Guard, which had absorbed the lighthouse service in 1939, automated its lighthouses over a similar period. The process was driven by the same combination of technical capability and financial pressure. Maintaining a family or a crew at a remote lighthouse station was expensive. Automating the station was a one-time capital cost followed by much lower ongoing maintenance costs. The arithmetic was not complicated. What the arithmetic did not capture, and what no spreadsheet could quantify, was what was lost when the keeper left. The keeper was not just an operator of equipment. The keeper was a presence. A human being at a fixed point on the coastline, watching the sea, recording the weather, observing the passage of ships, maintaining a physical structure, and embodying a continuity of attention that no automated system could replicate. The keeper noticed things that sensors did not measure. The keeper made judgments that algorithms could not make. The keeper was, in a sense that is difficult to articulate precisely, but impossible to dismiss, the conscience of the lighthouse. The person who cared whether the light was not just functioning, but functioning well. When the keepers left, the lighthouses continued to work. The lights burned. The lenses rotated. The fog signals sounded. The automated systems performed their functions with a reliability that was, in most cases, equal to or better than what a human keeper could achieve. The engineering case for automation was solid, but something changed in the character of the coastline when the keepers were withdrawn. The lighthouses became machines. They had always been machines in a sense, but they had been machines with human beings inside them. And those human beings had given the machines a quality that is difficult to name but easy to recognize in its absence. The light was still there, but nobody was home. The last keepers. Their stories have a particular quality, a mixture of pride, resignation, and a quiet awareness that they are the final representatives of something that will not continue after them. In Scotland, the last manned lighthouse was the Butt of Lewis, at the northern tip of the Isle of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides. The keepers left in 1998. The automation equipment was installed, tested, and commissioned. The keys were handed over. The cottages were closed up, and the light continued to burn, as it had burned since 1862, but now it burned alone. The keepers who served at the Butt of Lewis during its final years of manned operation knew they were part of an ending. They had watched other stations close around them, one by one, as the automation program worked its way through the Northern Lighthouse Board's inventory. They knew their turn was coming. They prepared for it with the same methodical attention they brought to every other aspect of their work, because that was the kind of people they were. In England, the last manned Trinity House lighthouse was North Foreland on the coast of Kent, which was automated on November 26, 1998. The date was noted in the press, briefly, as the end of an era, and then the news cycle moved on to other things. The keepers dispersed into retirement or into other roles within Trinity House. The tower continued its work, attended now by technicians who visited periodically rather than keepers who lived there permanently. In Ireland, the commissioners of Irish Lights completed their automation program around the same time. The Bailey Lighthouse on Howth Head, overlooking Dublin Bay, was among the last to be automated. The keepers left, and the light that had guided ships into Dublin for over a century and a half continued without them. In the United States, the story of the last keeper is more complicated, because the Coast Guard maintained a keeper at Boston Light, the oldest lighthouse site in the country, as a deliberate act of historical preservation. Sally Snowman, appointed as the keeper of Boston Light in 2003, is often described as the last civilian lighthouse keeper in the United States. Her role is partly ceremonial and partly educational. She maintains the station, gives tours, and serves as a living link to the tradition of lighthouse keeping. But she is also, in a very real sense, the keeper. She tends the light. She maintains the station. She climbs the stairs. The continuity is not just symbolic. Congress passed legislation in 1989 requiring that Boston Light remain permanently staffed, making it the only lighthouse in the United States with a legal guarantee of human presence. This is an extraordinary piece of legislation when you think about it. A law that says, in effect, that this particular machine must always have a person inside it, not because the machine needs the person to function, but because the person is part of what the machine means. That distinction between function and meaning is at the heart of what happened when the keepers left. The automated lighthouse functions perfectly well, but the meaning of the lighthouse, the cultural and emotional weight it carries, is bound up with the idea of the keeper. And without the keeper, the meaning shifts. The lighthouse becomes infrastructure. It stops being a story. What happens to an abandoned lighthouse? The word abandoned is not quite right for most of them, because most decommissioned lighthouses are not truly abandoned. They are automated. The light still works. The equipment is maintained. The structure is inspected periodically. But the human habitation has ended, and a lighthouse without inhabitants changes in ways that are both predictable and subtly sad. The cottage deteriorates first. Without daily occupation, without heating in winter and ventilation in summer, without the constant minor maintenance that comes from someone simply living in a building, the keeper's cottage begins to decline. Damp enters, paint peels, window frames rot, gutters block. The garden, no longer tended, reverts to whatever the local vegetation wants to do with it, which is usually some combination of grass, bramble, and wind-blown scrub. The tower is more resilient. Lighthouse towers were built to withstand storms, salt spray, and decades of exposure, and they do. The granite and cast iron structures of the 19th century are, in many cases, in remarkable condition, despite decades without permanent inhabitants. The engineering that went into them was conservative and robust, designed to last, designed to resist, designed to endure exactly the kind of neglect that automation would eventually impose. But even the tower changes. Without a keeper to spot and repair minor damage, small problems accumulate. A cracked window lets in rain. A corroded fitting admits salt air. A blocked drain allows water to pool where it should not. None of these problems is catastrophic in isolation, but over years and decades they compound, and a lighthouse that was impeccably maintained under human occupation becomes slowly, imperceptibly less perfect under automated management. Some lighthouses have been preserved as heritage sites, museums, or tourist attractions. These are, generally, the ones with the most dramatic locations, the most interesting histories, or the most engaged local communities. They are maintained by volunteer organizations, by government heritage agencies, or by private owners who have purchased them from the Lighthouse Authority and invested in their restoration. Some have been converted to private residences. Living in a lighthouse is, for a certain kind of person, an irresistible proposition. The drama of the location, the romance of the history, the sheer novelty of living in a cylindrical stone tower with a lantern room on top. The practical challenges are significant. Remote locations, expensive maintenance, limited space, exposure to weather. But the people who buy lighthouses tend to be people who are not deterred by practical challenges. Some have been converted to hotels, bed and breakfasts, or vacation rentals. These conversions range from sensitive historical restorations to commercial developments that retain the external form of the lighthouse while completely transforming its interior. The keeper's cottage becomes guest rooms. The tower becomes a feature. The lens, if it survives, becomes a conversation piece. And some lighthouses have simply been left, not maintained, not converted, not preserved, left to the weather and the sea and the slow, patient work of deterioration. These are the ones that produce the most affecting photographs. Towers standing alone on eroding headlands, lantern rooms empty of glass, walls stained with salt and age, the whole structure gradually becoming part of the landscape it was built to stand apart from. There is something in the image of an abandoned lighthouse that goes beyond the ordinary sadness of a disused building. It is the specificity of the abandonment that gives it weight. This was not just a building. It was a building where someone lived for the specific purpose of keeping other people safe. The emptiness of the tower is not just physical absence. It is the absence of a particular kind of care. The modern lighthouse is a very different thing from the lighthouse that the keepers maintained, though it serves the same fundamental purpose. The Fresnel lens, in most active lighthouses, has been replaced by a much smaller, lighter, and more efficient LED array or sealed beam lamp. These modern light sources produce a beam that is visible at the required range with a fraction of the energy consumption of the old oil and lens system. They are reliable, long-lasting, and require minimal maintenance. They do not need polishing. They do not need trimming. They do not need someone to climb the tower at midnight to check on them. The rotation mechanism, where rotation is still required to produce a characteristic flash pattern, is typically an electric motor rather than a clockwork system. In many modern lighthouses, the flash pattern is produced electronically rather than mechanically. The lamp itself is switched on and off in the required sequence, eliminating the need for a rotating lens entirely. GPS has reduced the navigational importance of lighthouses significantly. A modern ship's navigator can determine the vessel's position to within a few meters using satellite navigation, and the electronic chart display on the bridge shows the ship's position relative to every hazard in the area in real time. The lighthouse, in this context, is a backup, a visual confirmation of position that supplements the electronic systems but is no longer the primary means of navigation. And yet, the lighthouses remain. This is worth pausing on. If GPS has made the lighthouse functionally unnecessary for most navigation purposes, why are lighthouse authorities around the world still maintaining them? Why are the lights still burning? Why is the infrastructure still in place? The answer is partly practical. GPS is a satellite-based system, and satellite systems can fail. Solar storms can disrupt satellite signals. Equipment malfunctions can render a ship's electronic navigation system unreliable. In these situations, visual aids to navigation, including lighthouses, become the backup that prevents a technical failure from becoming a maritime disaster. Lighthouse authorities maintain their lights as part of a layered navigation system in which no single technology is relied upon exclusively. The answer is also partly legal and regulatory. International maritime conventions require signatory nations to maintain aids to navigation along their coastlines, and these requirements have not been eliminated by the advent of GPS. Lighthouses that are listed in international light lists must be maintained in operational condition, and the lighthouse authorities comply with this obligation, even when the practical necessity of individual lights is debatable. But the answer is also, quietly, and without anyone quite saying so, cultural. Lighthouses matter to people. They matter as symbols, as landmarks, as elements of the coastal landscape that connect the present to the past. The decision to maintain a lighthouse is not always a purely rational calculation of navigational necessity. It is sometimes a recognition that certain structures carry a weight of meaning that transcends their function, and that allowing them to go dark would represent a loss that cannot be measured in economic terms. The light at the top of the tower is, in many cases, no longer the most important thing about the lighthouse. The most important thing is that the lighthouse is still there, still standing, still sending its beam out over the water, the way it has done for 100 or 200 years. The light is a statement. It says, "This coastline is watched. This passage is marked. Someone, or something, is paying attention. The keeper is gone. But the attention continues. 100 sleepy facts about lighthouses and the people who lived in them. Here is one. The spiral staircases inside lighthouse towers almost always spiral clockwise as you ascend. This is not an accident. It is a holdover from castle architecture, where clockwise spirals gave a right-handed defender an advantage over a right-handed attacker climbing from below. Lighthouse builders adopted the convention without the military rationale, simply because it was the way spiral stairs were built, and the tradition persisted long after anyone remembered why. The tallest lighthouse in the world is the Jeddah Light in Saudi Arabia. a steel structure standing 133 meters above sea level. It does not look like a traditional lighthouse. It looks like a modern industrial tower, but it serves the same purpose as the Pharos of Alexandria, which stood roughly the same distance from Jeddah on the other side of the Red Sea more than 2,000 years earlier. Lighthouse keepers in the 19th century were typically paid less than skilled tradesmen ashore. In the United States, a keeper's annual salary in the 1850s was around $400 to $600, depending on the station and the region. This was a living wage, but not a comfortable one, particularly given the isolation and the demands of the job. Keepers supplemented their income by fishing, by keeping livestock where the station grounds permitted it, and by the occasional salvage of materials washed ashore. The revolving mechanism of a first-order Fresnel lens was typically driven by a weight suspended on a cable that ran down through the center of the lighthouse tower. The weight descended slowly under gravity, turning the lens as it fell. When the weight reached the bottom, the keeper had to climb to the mechanism room and wind it back to the top using a hand crank. At a tall tower, this winding process could take 10 to 15 minutes and was repeated every 2 to 4 hours throughout the night. The physical effort was roughly equivalent to winding a very large, very heavy clock, and it was performed in the dark, on narrow stairs, in all states of weather and personal exhaustion. Cats were the most common animals at lighthouse stations because lighthouses attracted mice, and mice chewed through supplies, gnawed on equipment, and generally made themselves unwelcome. A good lighthouse cat was a valued member of the station and was sometimes noted in the keeper's log with a frequency and affection that human visitors did not always receive. The color of a lighthouse, its day mark, was as important as its light for navigation purposes. A lighthouse painted white with a red band was a different navigational aid from a lighthouse painted white with a black band, and a navigator who could see the tower during daylight could identify the station by its paint scheme alone, without needing to wait for nightfall to observe the light's characteristic flash pattern. Keepers were responsible for maintaining the paintwork to the correct specification, which meant regular exterior painting of a tall, exposed structure in conditions that professional house painters would have refused to work in. The keeper's cottage at many lighthouse stations was built to a standard design specified by the Lighthouse Authority, which meant that a keeper transferring from one station to another might find himself in a house that was architecturally identical to the one he had just left, despite being hundreds of miles away in a completely different landscape. This standardization was efficient from an administrative perspective, but produced a faintly surreal quality of life for the keepers who experienced it. The same rooms, the same layout, the same view from the kitchen window onto a completely different piece of coast. Lighthouse keepers were required to maintain their station in a state of readiness for inspection at all times, which meant that there was no off-season, no relaxed period, no time when standards could be temporarily lowered. The principal keeper's quarters were expected to be clean, orderly, and presentable every day of the year, and the tower and its equipment were expected to meet the same standard. This permanent state of readiness was, for some keepers, a source of professional pride. For others, it was a source of ongoing, low-grade stress that never fully dissipated. The fog was the keeper's enemy. Not the storms, not the isolation, not the cold. The fog. Because fog meant the fog signal, and the fog signal meant noise, effort, sleeplessness, and the knowledge that the light, the keeper's primary responsibility, the thing at the center of everything, was temporarily useless. Keepers' children at isolated stations sometimes received their education by correspondence. Lessons arrived by mail, were completed at the kitchen table and were sent back for grading by the next supply boat. The quality of this education varied enormously, depending on the materials available, the engagement of the parents supervising the work, and the reliability of the mail service. Some keepers' children emerged from this arrangement with an education that was adequate. Others emerged with an education that was exceptional, because their parent had the time, the intelligence, and the determination to ensure that isolation did not mean ignorance. The smell of a working lighthouse in the oil era was distinctive, and to the keepers who lived with it, both familiar and inescapable. It was a combination of whale oil or kerosene, hot metal, polish, damp stone, salt air, and the particular mustiness of a building that was never entirely dry. Keepers who retired from the service sometimes said that they missed the smell, which is the kind of detail that reveals more about the nature of human attachment than any amount of analysis. Fresnel lenses are still being manufactured, though in very small numbers and primarily for heritage restoration projects. The skills required to grind and assemble the glass prisms to the original specifications are maintained by a handful of specialist workshops, mostly in France, where the technology originated. A first-order Fresnel lens, if you could commission one today, would cost a figure that would make most people reconsider their interest in lighthouses. The mercury baths that supported the rotating lenses were eventually replaced by roller bearings and ball bearings as engineering precision improved. The removal of mercury from lighthouse lantern rooms was a significant environmental remediation task at many stations, because the mercury had, over decades, seeped into the fabric of the building and contaminated the surrounding soil. This cleanup was performed quietly, without much public attention, and the health effects on the keepers who had worked with the mercury for years were rarely discussed. The keeper's logbook was typically a hardbound volume issued by the Lighthouse Authority with pre-printed columns for the required data entries. The books were numbered sequentially and, when completed, were returned to the Lighthouse Authority's head office for archival storage. Many thousands of these volumes survive in archives in London, Edinburgh, Dublin, Washington, Paris, and other capitals, constituting an unbroken daily record of coastal conditions and lighthouse operations stretching back, in some cases, more than 200 years. A lighthouse beam does not actually travel in a single straight line. It is shaped by the lens into a narrow, flat sheet of light that extends horizontally in all directions from the lantern room as the lens rotates. What a navigator sees from a ship at sea is a brief flash as the beam sweeps past the ship's position. The duration and interval of these flashes, the light's character, is what identifies the lighthouse. The clockwork mechanisms used to rotate lighthouse lenses were manufactured by a small number of specialist firms, and the precision required was comparable to that of high-quality clock and watchmaking. The mechanism had to maintain a constant rotational speed despite variations in temperature, humidity, and the mechanical condition of the bearings, because any variation in speed would alter the apparent flash pattern of the light and could mislead a navigator. Some keepers carved their names into the walls of their lighthouses. These inscriptions survive at stations around the world, usually in the stairwell or the service room below the lantern. Names, dates, sometimes brief messages, scratched or chiseled into the stonework by people who wanted to leave some evidence that they had been there. These are not defacements, they are testimonies. The supply boat was the lighthouse keeper's lifeline at offshore and island stations. Its arrival brought food, fuel, mail, replacement parts, and news from the mainland. Its departure took away the completed logbooks, the keeper's personal correspondence, and sometimes the keeper himself, if it was time for shore leave. The supply boat was also the mechanism by which the Lighthouse Authority maintained its supervision of the station The boat brought inspectors, maintenance crews, and relief keepers, and it was often the only vessel that visited the station for weeks at a time. Keepers at some stations maintained vegetable gardens that were models of intensive cultivation, producing remarkable yields from small plots of often poor soil. The garden was a practical necessity at stations where fresh produce was otherwise unavailable, but it was also, for many keepers, a source of genuine pleasure, a living thing to care for, a connection to the rhythms of growth and season that the mechanical demands of the lighthouse did not provide. The shortest-serving lighthouse keeper in recorded history is difficult to identify with certainty, but there are documented cases of keepers who arrived at their station, took one look at the conditions, and asked to be transferred immediately. Not everyone was suited to the life, and the lighthouse authorities, while not always sympathetic, recognized that a miserable keeper was a potentially dangerous keeper and generally arranged transfers when it became clear that a posting was not working. The longest-serving keepers are easier to identify, and their tenures are remarkable. There are documented cases of keepers who served at a single station for 40 years or more, arriving as young men and leaving as old ones, having spent the majority of their adult lives in the same tower, on the same rock, watching the same stretch of sea. The lighthouse was not just their workplace, it was their life's work, their home, and the place where they understood themselves most completely. Lighthouse keepers were among the first people to observe and document the phenomenon of St. Elmo's fire, the luminous plasma discharge that sometimes appears on the tips of tall, pointed structures during thunderstorms. Keepers described it in their logs as a strange, blue-white glow that appeared on the lightning conductor or the lantern room gallery during electrical storms, flickering and dancing in a way that was both beautiful and faintly unnerving. The phenomenon is well understood by modern physics. But to a keeper alone in a tower during a thunderstorm, watching his lightning rod glow with an unearthly light, the experience was something other than scientific. The sound of the sea against a lighthouse tower is not a single sound, but a complex, changing composition that varies with the tide, the wind, the swell, and the architecture of the rock on which the tower stands. Keepers at different stations describe distinctly different sound environments. A deep, resonant boom at one tower, a hissing rush at another, a rhythmic percussion at a third. The sea had a voice at every lighthouse, and the keeper learned to read it the way a musician reads a score, interpreting its changes as indicators of weather, tide, and the general state of the world outside the walls. The last Fresnel lens to be manufactured for an active lighthouse, rather than for a museum or a restoration project, was produced sometime in the mid-20th century, marking the end of a manufacturing tradition that had lasted just over 100 years. The lens design that Augustin Fresnel created in the early 1820s was still being produced, with only minor modifications, more than a century later. Very few technologies achieve that kind of longevity. Keepers at some stations were responsible for maintaining a flagpole and flying the appropriate flags and signals according to the rules of the Lighthouse Authority and the International Maritime Signal Code. This was a minor but persistent responsibility, and the condition of the flags, clean, unfaded, properly folded when not in use, was among the details checked during inspections. The rotation speed of a first-order Fresnel lens was typically one complete revolution, every 1 to 4 minutes, depending on the light's characteristic flash pattern. The keeper could hear the mechanism turning, a slow, steady, barely perceptible sound that was part of the background texture of life in the tower. Keepers who had served for many years reported that they could tell, from the sound alone, whether the mechanism was running at the correct speed or whether something was slightly wrong with the gearing or the bearings. Several lighthouse stations around the world are now designated as UNESCO World Heritage Sites or are included within larger World Heritage designations. The Tower of Hercules in Spain, mentioned earlier, received its designation in 2009. These recognitions reflect a growing international awareness that lighthouses are not merely functional infrastructure, but cultural monuments of universal significance. There is a tradition, in some lighthouse communities, of ringing a bell to mark the passing of a keeper. The bell, sometimes the actual fog bell from the keeper's station, sometimes a church bell in the keeper's home community, is rung a specific number of times, corresponding to the keeper's years of service. It is a tradition that acknowledges both the duration and the nature of the service, each ring representing a year of nights spent in the tower, a year of maintenance performed, a year of the light kept burning. The paint used on lighthouse exteriors was specially formulated to resist salt spray, ultraviolet degradation, and the abrasion of wind-driven sand and rain. The development of lighthouse paint was a minor but genuine field of material science pursued by lighthouse authorities and paint manufacturers in collaboration over many decades. The white paint that makes a lighthouse visible during daylight is not ordinary white paint. It is a product designed for one of the most demanding exterior environments on Earth. The staircase in a tall lighthouse tower might contain 200 or more individual steps. The keeper climbed these steps multiple times every day, ascending to the lantern room at sunset to light the lamp, descending to the service room to wind the clockwork, ascending again to check the light, descending to record the log entry, ascending again at dawn to extinguish the lamp and begin cleaning the lens. Over a career of 30 or 40 years, the total number of steps climbed is a figure that the human mind resists calculating, not because it is difficult to compute, but because the result is so large as to feel implausible. The final keepers at many stations left behind small personal touches that subsequent visitors and maintenance crews occasionally discover. A name penciled on a wall, a shelf of books, a calendar stopped on the date of departure, a coffee mug on a hook. These are not artifacts of any particular significance. They are simply the traces of a human presence that was there one day and gone the next, and that will not return. The light is still on. The lens, or its modern replacement, is still turning. The beam still sweeps out across the water, reaching for the horizon, finding the ships that need it, and passing over the ones that do not. The keeper is gone. The light remains. The shore again. Come back down the stairs now. The iron is cold under your hand. The walls are close. The sound of the sea changes as you descend, louder at the base, more resonant, closer. Step outside. The wind is doing what it always does out here, pushing at you sideways, carrying salt and the sound of water breaking somewhere below in the dark. The beam passes overhead every few seconds, a bright arm sweeping the sky, reaching out over the sea and then returning, again and again, patient and mechanical, and in the absence of the person who used to tend it, somehow still faithful. The lighthouse keeper's life was not romantic. It was not tragic. It was not heroic in the way that word is usually meant. It was something more difficult to categorize and more important to understand. A life of sustained, quiet, unglamorous attention to a task that mattered enormously and was noticed almost never. The keeper trimmed the wick. The keeper polished the lens. The keeper wound the clockwork. The keeper wrote in the log. The keeper watched the sea. The keeper kept the light burning through the night so that ships could find their way. And then the keeper did it again the next night, and the night after that, and the night after that, for years and decades. In storms and fog and bitter cold, and the long, still, clear nights, when the stars were visible from horizon to horizon, and the only sound was the slow rotation of the lens and the sea moving against the rock. And then the keeper left, and the machine kept running, and the world barely noticed, because the world had never quite noticed in the first place. There is a lesson in that, though it is not a lesson that can be easily stated or neatly summarized. It has something to do with the relationship between attention and invisibility. The way that the most important forms of care are often the ones that disappear into the background of daily life, noticed only in their absence, appreciated only when they fail. The lighthouse keeper cared for the light. The light cared for the ships. The ships carried the cargo and the passengers and the commerce that kept the world connected. And the whole chain of care, from the keeper's hand on the wick to the ship's safe arrival in port, was invisible to everyone except the people whose lives depended on it. Tonight, somewhere on a coastline that you have never visited, a light is turning. It is automated now. Nobody is inside the tower. The lens rotates on its electric motor. The lamp burns with a steady, unwavering brightness. The fog signal stands ready to sound if the sensors detect that visibility has dropped below the threshold. The system works. The ships are safe. The light keeps burning. But no one is writing in the logbook. No one is watching from the gallery. No one is climbing the stairs in the middle of the night to check the flame, to listen to the sound of the mechanism, to look out at the sea and note, with quiet professional attention, the direction of the wind and the state of the sky and the distant lights of a ship passing safely on its way. That person is gone. That kind of attention is gone with them. And the light, which does not know the difference, continues to turn, faithful and mechanical and alone, sending its beam out into the dark for anyone who needs it, the way it always has, the way it always will, whether anyone is watching or not. The stairs are empty now. The cottage is closed. The logbook is full. Sleep well. The light is still on.